No, there'll be no singing this evening. Well, good evening. Good evening. Oh, good to see all of you. We'll be talking about chapter 9 tonight. I'll open us in prayer in just a moment. And so let's see. We've got, is it 12 chapters in this thing? Trying to check. Well, no, we got chapter 10, and then we have this epilogue, and then the conclusion. So we'll be done with this certainly by end of May, certainly by some point in June, and we'll be wrapping it up and moving on to the next thing. I'm not sure what the next thing is going to be yet. The session tomorrow night is discussing. It's kind of become a tradition here. I think it got introduced when Bill Linder was here. Of taking a break from Wednesday night stuff for the month of July. And so I would say that hasn't been session approved yet, but I would say you can anticipate it. And so kind of that gives us a chance to hit the reset button. We'll probably kind of take some time to think about where we want to go after this. I am really keen to do a class. Well, it could be in here, it could be, in the fellowship hall, I don't care where it is, but a class on worship and what the gathered worship service is, and kind of what it is that we're doing. So almost like if you take a course in, I don't know, in engineering or something like that, you kind of learn what goes on behind the scenes of stuff that you know about and how stuff is put together. And that's kind of what I'd love to take some time to do in August, to talk about, what is it that's happening when we gather together for worship, and like, why is there any purpose or point or biblical principle behind having a call to worship or a benediction, or and why does it matter what we sing? And so when I was interviewed by the search committee to take this to see if I was going to be fit for this position at the church here, I produced a document for them. I think I called it was good when they said unto me, and it was just a sort of 3 to 4 page statement on what I believe worship is and what it's for, and I think it'd be great for us to just kind of take a look at that and go through it together and see what we think about it. I'd love to get some feedback from you on it. But anyway, so that's kind of what I'm kind of thinking over for August, and I've been reading lots of stuff on worship from a couple of different authors. One of them, Bob Kauflin, who's written some of the songs that we sing on Sunday, including, can you rattle off a couple of Bob Kauflin's stuff that we... Glory be to our great God. Okay. Yeah, I know. Reformation song? What about the new one that we... That's City of Light. Okay. Anyway. But it sounds very Kauflin. Yeah, it sounds very Kauflin-esque. If you've ever listened to the albums for Together for the Gospel conferences, which is Sovereign Grace, yeah, all that, yeah, Bob Kauflin stuff. So yeah. Well, anyway, I've babbled on enough about that. Let's pray, and then we will begin. Our Father, we thank you again for this time that you've given us to study and to think together about the world in which we live and how to be Christians in it. Help us as we seek to do just that. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'm going to be relatively brief as we go over some of this information, mainly looking for any comments from you or things that you learned. I have, just like I did a couple of weeks ago, kind of admittedly spent more time developing some reflections for kind of what do we do with this, and how do Christians respond to this. And so I've done that once before in here, and I'm going to try to do it again, time permitting. Just kind of have some principles that I'd like to discuss with you. But why don't we go ahead and begin then our study of chapter 9, the triumph of the therapeutic, okay? And so what Truman does in this chapter is focus on a lot of how these developments that we've already been talking about have impacted the Supreme Court decisions, kind of law of the land talk, as well as talking about how they've influenced ethics, and how the therapeutic, that is the goal of comforting the internal psychologized self, has become the unspoken goal of a lot of culture itself and cultural institutions. And so for one example of that, Truman goes to the Supreme Court and the debate over gay marriage, which he he starts much earlier than the Obergefell decision. We'll talk about that in a moment, but I want to begin with this quotation from Truman. He says, "Gay marriage did not make gay marriage plausible, and the Supreme Court did not make gay marriage plausible." This is page 303. "Gay marriage is plausible because of the wider transformation of the social imaginary that we've noted in earlier chapters, and the background to and justification offered by the majority for the Obergefell decision demonstrate this fact." Translation: the stuff that we have been talking about, in particular for this chapter, the triumph of the therapeutic perspective and psychological man, set the stage and paved the way such that you could almost say that the Obergefell decision was unavoidable, barring some amazing sort of reversal of things. So he goes back to 92, where he begins with Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey. And this is an excerpt again, page 303. "At the heart of liberty," this is an excerpt from the court's decision. "At the heart of liberty," so this is Supreme Court justices saying this, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence." Now let that settle for a minute. In 1992, the Supreme Court decision in Planned Parenthood versus Casey is the Supreme Court decision, their grounding for it is, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." And then further, "Beliefs about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood were they formed under the compulsion of the state," which is a bit self-defeating, because if the state cannot define these matters like existence, meaning, and human life, how exactly is the Supreme Court ruling on them, right? Which Truman points out. This ruling was significant, though, because it cemented into law the notion, in this Supreme Court decision, that the notion of individual freedom that underlies this whole concept of selfhood expressed in what we've read so far. All right, so the next he talks about Lawrence versus Texas, where Anton and Scalia basically pointed out that overturning laws governing sexual activity and sodomy and how the decision to do that was based on public disapproval to some extent. So Scalia pointed out that the decisions that were being made about overturning laws and precedent that had to do with sex, that he's saying, well then wait, so if public disapproval is what we're grounding this in, then how far does that go? Where does that train stop, so to speak? But the bigger point, perhaps, is that Scalia's point about precedent has proven to be somewhat prophetic, that Lawrence versus Texas was a pragmatic approach to legal decisions, that a culture of psychologized selfhood and an ethics based on happiness would engender. So the idea is, well, this keeps people from being happy, and so that's our grounding or explanation for why it's good or bad. If it keeps people from being happy, then it's bad. Sorry, I got to silence my own phone. All right. So the key issue then becomes not philosophical consistency, but the therapeutic result that needs to be achieved by any plausible means necessary, right? And keep in mind, if you ever are in a conversation with someone about these things, perhaps, let's imagine, and they raise the issue of the slippery slope fallacy. Let's talk about that for a minute. The slippery slope fallacy, which is the fallacy that, if event A leads to B, leads to C, leads to, so on and so forth, it provides a slippery slope. That you can't always count on a slippery slope as a given, that there's going to be this consequence of all of these dominoes falling. To which I say, fair enough, but there's a difference between arguing that a slope is slippery and arguing for consistency. Those are two very different things. So like to argue for a slippery slope is you're saying A will cause B, and then B will cause C, and then C will cause D, which is different from just saying this idea is not consistent with this one, or if you follow this idea to its logical conclusion, then you get, this. So there's a difference between those two things. And so then, let's see, this is the quote from Truman again. "If society needs abortion rights to keep women happy, then the law must be made to yield such results." That's the consequence. "If society requires the affirmation of certain sexual activities and identities to affirm certain classes of individuals, then the law must be made to yield to those results." Okay? And so this is what Truman means when he talks about the triumph of the therapeutic, that the basic idea or the basic grounding for these decisions is that it keeps, for instance, in the case of Lawrence, Texas, it keeps those in this new term that we've invented, sexual minorities, from feeling ostracized, excluded, unfairly set upon. United States versus Windsor was to me the big one. So this was the overturning of DOMA, and I remember a conversation with a cousin of mine who was in law school at the time. At the time of, I guess it was 2011, 2012, somewhere. So it was before U.S. versus Windsor, and he just told me, he was like, DOMA is going to be overturned. You can count on it, and here's why. And he explained to me why, and he was slightly to the left of Marx, so he was excited about it getting overturned. And by the way, if you don't know what DOMA is, in 2013, DOMA still existed. It was the Defense of Marriage Act, which stated that marriage was between a man and a woman. Okay, U.S. versus Windsor in 2013 is what overturned DOMA. The argument was that DOMA deprives same-sex couples of marriage, and that the decision to do so was rooted in animus, in disapproval of a particular class of people, that's why DOMA existed. The goal was to impose a disadvantage and a stigma upon all who entered into same-sex marriage. In other words, it was assumed in the Supreme Court decision that overturned DOMA that the only reason why someone would oppose gay marriage is because they're bigots, not because they have a principled or even a reasoned opposition. Truman says on page 309, he uses if we want to start with a sort of a Christian definition of marriage, he said, let's just go to Book of Common Prayer, which gives a statement of what marriage is. And he said, one might disagree with the Book of Common Prayer's definition, but to dismiss it as irrational and a cloak for bigotry involves both a particular understanding of what constitutes a rational argument and a remarkable act of telepathy, mind reading, by which the hidden motivations of certain groups can be discerned by members of the Supreme Court. Okay? Truman says, the latter is highly unlikely. The former requires an act of cultural hubris, whereby the elites of contemporary culture have an apparent monopoly on what can be defined as rational. Okay? So that's again, what we're talking about then is not just pointing out that, we could say Supreme Court justices, 5 out of 9 of them made a bad call. That much is apparent, but rather that it's the language of the decision that the majority of the decision that went on record was basically, look, when it comes to DOMA, we know what's really going on here, right? It's rooted in bigotry. And so I have some things to say about that toward the end. We talk about how do we respond to kind of some of the directions of our culture. But it's why, let me just say this bit now, it's why I think it's helpful to be clear about our definitions. So when we speak of marriage, I'm familiar with some theologians and pastors who don't even really use the term gay marriage. They'll use the term, some will even use the term so-called gay marriage. And their insistence is because we're not saying that two men can't get married. We're saying that's not what marriage is in the first place. So it's not like, well, we really believe that it should be between a man and a woman. We're on team man and woman, so that's where we're going to plant our flag. No, the Christian position is that's what marriage is. And if what you're talking about is not that, then we're not talking about the same thing. Truman also comes back to this conversation about consistency. Let me read this bit to you. Under DOMA, every individual enjoyed the same rights and labored under the same restrictions as everyone else. Men, whether they were heterosexual or gay, could marry women and could not marry men. Women, whether they were heterosexual or lesbian, could marry men and could not marry women. So how is it that this can be interpreted as an enshrining of inequality? It would seem that such a judgment can be understood only in a situation in which equality is defined as the ability of every individual to redefine marriage in the manner in which he or she chooses. Okay? This notion is presumably not what the Supreme Court was consciously trying to achieve, but there are some obvious questions to ask about the ruling in this regard. Why can marriage not be between one man and two or more women? Why should marriage be restricted to a relationship that is exclusively human? Could the case not be made that a refusal to recognize polygamy or a marriage between a man and a dog would marginalize, in turn, the polygamous and zoophilic communities? Such questions might seem distasteful, but that takes us to the heart of what is happening. The rejection of the traditional arguments for marriage and the assertion that Doma enshrines inequality are really a function of the wider tastes of the culture in which the judgment takes place. Okay, so the point is that the motivation then is one of taste. Okay, taste dictates what is rational and what is described as animus. Okay, so that brings us then to Obergefell in 2015. I'm on page 311. 5-4 majority that gay marriage. Let me see if you have the book open to 311, then you already know the answer. But the Obergefell decision was not that gay marriage is good, not that gay marriage is real, not that gay marriage should be endorsed by all and appreciated by all. The ruling was what? Gay marriage is protected by the Constitution. Right? So that's the Supreme Court's job, right? To interpret the Constitution. 4-5 ruling that gay marriage is constitutional. So 4 points there that Truman makes that I think are really important. We're going to The ruling that gay marriage is constitutional and therefore to be recognized by the states rests on 4 particular principles as stated in the majority opinion. Okay? And so the first one has to do with autonomy. The first premise of the court's relevant precedents is that the right to personal choice regarding marriage is inherent in the concept of individual autonomy. Okay, so Truman says this is the triumph of expressive individualism right here. Further proof that the sexual revolution is really just an extension of the longer, kind of longer standing ongoing revolution of the self. Okay, so in other words, you have to be able to kind of achieve what you want, achieve your goals in terms of your desires. And if we don't legitimize gay marriage, then that can't happen. Number 2, this is where it gets really interesting. A second principle in this court's jurisprudence is that the right to marry is fundamental because it supports a 2-person union, unlike any other, in its importance to the committed individuals. So historically, and this is where I think maybe the church, let's just say through the decades, has maybe not been as clear as she could have been, because historically, marriage's uniqueness is about 2 things: children and a lifelong bond. Okay? Children and a lifelong bond, not the fact that 2 people happen to be participating in the union. Right? Both of those are endangered. That is, the idea that marriage is about children, marriage is about lifelong union. Both of those are like up for grabs thanks to divorce laws and other things. Polygamy is historically attested, but still assumes a man-woman relationship. So why does the number of people enjoy a normative position? So that's what's normative, that's what's normal, while the sex of the person does not, man or woman. These are assumptions of what I call assumptions of the modern moment. The reality is that polygamy just hasn't been normalized yet. What? Renormalized, you might say. Yeah, if you go back far enough, I suppose that's right. Too many tax breaks, and yeah, that's true. That's a very good point. And Truman points out that, at least in the social imaginary, the cultural imagination at the moment, polygamy is still seen as exploitative of women by men, which, like, for now is, that's, certainly is a bad thing, but that's sort of, we're in a moment where our culture still finds that particular aspect of things offensive. So that's why we haven't seen polygamy yet. Yeah.
But there is a TV show.
Oh yeah.
That's trying to push it.
Yes.
What is it called?
Sister Wives. Yes. Yes. And the invention of a word that should send chills up your spine, which is thruple. Yeah. Yeah.
The court usually makes decisions based on case law.
Correct.
And for specifically gay marriage and abortion, there was no case law.
Correct.
So an activist court assumed the legislative prerogative and they made the case law.
Right. That's true. That's precisely Truman's point. Is that the way in which this decision was made set a new kind of precedent. Precedent itself is not new, but making decisions in this way was setting a new kind of precedent. So third, what was the third thing that the court said? A third basis for protecting the right to marry is that it safeguards children and families and thus draws meanings from the related rights of child rearing, procreation, and education. Let's talk about that. First, American law does not prioritize children or families. I would say no-fault divorce is proof of that. Truman acknowledges, you could point to alimony payments and things like that. I would say, okay, if that's all you got, then we're still in trouble. The reason, because a check is not a father, as it turns out. This reason uses traditional sounding language that really is it's a therapeutic concern. And please remember that gay marriage cannot produce children. And this is why, by the way, this is where I'm going to sound kind of curmudgeon-y, but I'm going to tell you why towards the end. What we call, the way we use the word family matters. It really matters, okay? So, to the point, and maybe you think I'm being too nitpicky here, but like Marissa and I are a married couple. We are not yet a family because we don't have kids yet. If we got a dog, we still would not be a family, okay? I'm sorry if that's treading on any toes. But like the words we use matter. And so if we got a bunch of dogs, we still wouldn't be a family. We'd just be people with a lot of dogs. But I'll get to that toward the end. Tradition, the fourth point. Yeah. Fourth and finally, this court's cases and the nation's traditions make it clear that marriage is a keystone of our social order. Tradition. It seems that tradition here is being used simply as something that's good when it complements the moment. So if you want to uphold tradition, man and woman together in marriage is a tradition. But that's what's being rejected here. And so you cannot eliminate a tradition by appealing to tradition. Truman argues this would be like arguing that since democracy is a great American tradition, we have to give your cat the right to vote. Right? It's an appeal to tradition, to overthrow tradition by way of changing the meaning of tradition. I'm going to say that again. An appeal to tradition to overthrow tradition by changing the meaning of tradition. Okay? So that's all on the court case decisions. I don't think I could summarize it any better than Mr. Frank did, and where we're going with this. The next part, Ivy League ethics. Any questions before we go there, though? Questions or comments? Yeah. Okay. Sure. Ladies first.
I looked up the definition of therapeutic,
Yes.
and the way he's used it here
Yes.
has nothing to do with the traditional
Oh.
definition.
All right.
So I'm kind of curious as to how you would define his use of the word therapeutic.
Sure. Based on what I've read from Truman, I would say that his use of therapeutic means that if we classify an attitude or an objective as therapeutic, then the main question that's in play is, does it make me happy or comfort me sort of emotionally, give me kind of equilibrium in the state that I'm in? Or does it make me feel... Yeah. Does it make me feel psychologically harmed? Does it make me feel excluded? Does it make me feel undignified? In particular, the loss of dignity is a big part of this. Yes, emotional well-being is a big part of it. So for those of you listening online, Sandy said that the dictionary definition of therapeutic doesn't quite square with the way that Truman is using it. And so that's what I think he's getting at there. Well, sure. Thank you.
It's always intrigued me in my law enforcement career how many times people assume that because their feelings have been hurt, the law has been broken.
Will, our resident lawman, our resident police officer, has told us that he's been shocked by how many people believe that if their feelings have been hurt, then surely a law has been broken. That's occurring with more regularity, you would say. Huh.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Now, earlier this week, I was involved in a case, and just an observation. Connie and I talked about it when I got home.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought it was really interesting. And the case involved some high school kids
Mm.
who had been caught. They were in possession of and were distributing child pornography.
Mm.
And when I say child pornography, I'm talking about like 5, 6 year olds.
Okay.
And what I thought was interesting is in conversations with suspects, with other people involved in the case, what I didn't see was this shock of the conscience.
Mm.
I thought that was interesting.
With those who were caught?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, just by it
Yeah.
should shock
Right,
the
yeah,
conscience to be
yeah.
aware that this is going on,
Yeah.
and it doesn't.
Right. So we're talking about probably what we would call kind of desensitization. That evil things should shock you, and the extent to which evil things don't shock you is a real problem. This is what I think this is what Paul talks about when he talks about suppressing the knowledge of the truth, and in a sense searing the conscience. It's a very serious thing. Yeah, so we say, Lord, have mercy on us. And so this is why, by the way, Paul is very careful to encourage his readers, don't do stuff that violates your conscience. It might not, it might not be sinful, and you might over time come to realize, okay, that's not sinful. But don't be in the habit of the pang of your conscience hits you, and you just go, no, and push it away. What were you going to say, Eddie?
I was just saying, to what you said about Paul.
Yeah.
It may not be sin yet.
Right, it may not be sin yet.
That could be defense around
Right.
the cliff.
Yes. Yeah, John Piper's helpful here. He said something like, he said, in plenty of times in my Christian life, he said, I've known myself and other Christians how you can smell that something's wrong before you know why. And sometimes that's true. And sometimes we can be, hypersensitive about things. That's true as well.
Can you say that again?
Sometimes so this is from Piper. He said sometimes we can smell that something's wrong before we know why it's wrong. And his point was that's not always the case. Sometimes you can have your sensitivities are kind of too raw and exposed. He said, but sometimes it's just you have instincts, and you have a sense that something is wrong, but even if you don't know why yet. And so yeah. So then let's see, page 315. We start this section called Ivy League Ethics, where Truman spends a great deal of time talking about Peter Singer. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about Singer, unless you guys want to unpack something specific you saw in there, other than to say, I can't put it better than Truman did when he said, something along the lines of, finally in Peter Singer we have found Nietzsche's madman, who is the one who's just crazy enough to be consistent, to follow his atheism to its conclusion or something like that. And so Singer points out that pro-choice arguments, broadly speaking, are based on this idea that life begins at the moment of birth. And he objects to that. He objects to the soundness of it. He doesn't object to abortion, but he objects to the soundness of it. He says that's an argument based on aesthetics. Basically, you can't see the cute baby, so it's okay to kill it, right? It's just an argument based on visuals, right? And the way he backs that up is he says sonograms. People can see their babies now before they're born, and it has resulted in fewer people getting abortions when they have a sonogram. And so he says, second, you have viability, which is where Roe v. Wade drew the line, by the way. Singer points out that viability is still dependent on the quality of care where you live. So viability, when a baby's viable, when a fetus is viable, really depends on the quality of care you've got. Yeah, right. So so he said, so that's arbitrary. That's not satisfying. Nor can you simply say that the mother has sovereign rights over the existence of her child simply because the child depends on her, right? Because Singer says, you probably know some people who are perhaps very old, very elderly, infirm, and their existence is dependent on somebody else. So can the somebody else shoot them? We'd say no. He also rejects the idea of quickening, which is the idea that you can call a fetus viable and a life at its first kind of movement. possession of a soul, etc. And he just says that's theological mystification, no way to know that. And then he addresses the moment at which a child feels pain. He just says hopelessly arbitrary. He rejects the idea of the argument that says if we can't have abortions, if you make abortions illegal, for instance, then you're going to have back alley abortions and all that. And he just said, well, now you're just making an argument about legal consequences. You still haven't told me whether or not it's moral, right? So he also rejects the feminist argument that the baby is part of her body. He rejects that, pointing out that you can't really measure the overall impact. So if it's my body, it's my happiness that's at stake. And his response is like, well, there's really no way to be certain that having the child wouldn't lead to more happiness. Like you actually can't guarantee that in any way, shape, or form for you, the mother, or for the rest of the world, in fact. So why does he advocate abortion and even infanticide? Because he rejects human exceptionalism. Okay? So he rejects and has a highly qualified, at first I thought, the early part of the chapter, I thought he rejected personhood. That's probably not fair. He just has such a highly qualified definition of what it means to be a person. So he believes that mankind, basically animals. Human exceptionalism, he calls it speciesism, right? Because you're privileging humans over dogs, to which all Christians should just go, yeah. Awareness that we have a past, and so he says, Singer says, personhood is bound up in consciousness, that is, awareness that you have a past, present, and future. Second, a person has to be capable of making decisions, and they have to want to live. So autonomy assumes a certain level of rationality. So then given those criteria, a baby in the womb is not a person according to him. A child in the womb has no consciousness of past, present, or future, not autonomous, has no capacity for rational reflection, so not a person. So doesn't have the rights of personhood. And so the child in the womb then is no more self-conscious than the deer that you shot for food. And of course the implications are obvious for the mentally impaired or the senile. And so Singer, for me, I think is a product of utilitarianism, which is, that's eventually where he comes down the whole debate. He's just, does this produce happiness or profound unhappiness? And so he says, so here's where he says, sorry, and I misspoke earlier. When dealing with infanticide, why is he opposed to infanticide? Here's his reason. Or in some cases, he says, well, if you kill an infant child, it reduces the potential happiness of parents or even adoptive parents. But he doesn't actually then apply that to abortion. So like this potential life, and I misspoke earlier, I think I included that in the reasons. This potential life then, if you can't wipe out an infant's life, then, because of potential happiness of adoptive parents, you could say the same for the baby in the womb. Singer doesn't. For some reason, he doesn't push that reasoning into abortion. So anyway, I think Singer's kind of interesting. I even found an article online from a fellow who he just wrote about how he was an atheist, and then he started reading Singer, and it freaked him out so bad he became a Christian. He was just like, well, he's right. This is where everything ultimately leads. I'm out of here. Which is kind of, so it's kind of interesting. It was like, well, all right. I mean, when I did a Google search on Singer and some other things, that was one of the first articles that came up. And so, Singer's just kind of interesting because I think that Truman's right. He's an example of this kind of Nietzschean, be serious about your consequences. But I just didn't find him very compelling, to be honest. And so I was more excited about talking about some of the stuff with the college campus stuff. So that's where we're going to move now, unless anybody has any questions. I kind of went through it quickly. Yep.
It's interesting, C.S. Lewis, in The Abolition of Man.
Yes.
Chapter 3, short chapter, well worth reading if you haven't.
Yeah.
But he brings up 2 points there, which is when you get rid of objective moral law
Uh-huh.
based from God.
Right.
He calls it the Tao. But
Yeah.
seriously, any objective moral standard, when you get rid of that, Lewis says, all you're left with is your emotion. Which is exactly what.
C.S. Lewis, Abolition of Man, Chapter 3, very short if you haven't read it, where Lewis argues that if you get rid of a moral objective lawgiver, then all you have is your feelings, right? Which is interesting to me, and I still haven't kind of figured out how to say more on this than, like I'm going to say this, and that's kind of where I'm going to stop, because this is as far as I've got. But it's interesting to me that in a culture that's like ours, that's really obsessed with power dynamics, because some of the influence of Marxism and things like that, and so we're really conscious that the powerful, when they get enough power, can really oppress those with less power. And if you're a Christian, you can affirm that. Like if you believe in original sin, that's not a secret to you, that when the people get to the top, they abuse their power. Yes, that's a reality. And so if that's the case, then, but apart from an objective moral lawgiver, all that's left is power to assert your will.
That's where the abolition of man comes in,
Right.
because man is going to exert so much power over other men
Right.
that eventually they will become animals.
Yes. And so like it's this contradiction that I'm still thinking about. I don't know where to go with it beyond what I've just said, which is like it's the Sittlichkeit, or the what's the other word? The German word? Zeitgeist. The worldview, the social imaginary. It's like terrified of power, but power is the only thing left based on the kind of premises. Anyway, campus anticulture is the next one. Campus anticulture. All right. And so the psychologized self, Truman says, tends to make good things into bad things. The Bible has some things to say about that. When the understanding of the self is formed by the polis, by the political, which is political man, then assaults on the polis or civic institutions will be regarded as serious crimes. So, previous generations, when we were in the place of economic man, right, political institutions were seen as being worthy of a lot of respect and having a lot of power over you to form and shape you. And so those civic institutions, if you we'll say sin against them, that's a serious crime. But in a world of the psychological and therapeutic self, we should expect things to be different. So that which is psychologically harmful then is what's most threatening to us. Therefore, that's what needs to be silenced. And so Truman talks about the case of Middlebury College, and this is Middlebury College right here. It looks rather lovely. And Charles Murray. So Murray is a political scientist. In 2017, he was asked to speak at the American Enterprise Club. And somebody tell me what page I'm on there, so if anybody's curious. 328. Thank you. Thank you, Renee. So page 328. And he sparked a protest when he went, and actually Allison Stanger, who was his sort of interlocutor, the liberal professor who was having the conversation / debate with him, she ended up getting injured by the protest. Murray's crime was that he had argued earlier in his career that intelligence played a role in America's economic divisions. Okay? And so that was the reason for the protest. Let me kind of find, let's see. Murray's crime was that he argued earlier in his career intelligence played a role in America's economic divisions, a point seen by his opponents to justify both racial and class prejudice. It is easy to dismiss the Middlebury incident as an example of what has come to be called the snowflake generation, a pejorative term used to describe the alleged inability of the rising generation of college students to engage with any viewpoint with which they happen to disagree. And so I appreciated kind of the way Truman handled this matter, because in a therapeutic culture, if you are part of a therapeutic culture, what's most important to you is that people don't threaten your psychological, therapeutic, if you will, equilibrium, right? And to some extent, I think Truman's done a good job of saying that's in all of us, not just college students, because for all of us, it's the air we breathe. And his point then was, and I'm paraphrasing him on 329, he just kind of makes this point: everybody's got a snowflake in them, to some degree. You have a higher sensitivity to things than you should, so be careful. And I'm going to talk more about that at the end. Ooh, yeah. He talks a bit about the state of the historical discipline, and which he surveys the history curriculum at Harvard. Listen to this. Harvard history curriculum right now: no classes on the Reformation or the Renaissance. But there are classes on Asian American history, Native American history, British colonial violence, feminism, and pornography. And Truman says that what this does is it reveals priorities. Okay? So this is not an expansion of the canon to be studied. Rather, the canon itself and the concept of canon is being abolished. So it's rather destabilization of the discipline. He also talked about the, what do we want to call it? The commodification of education, that students pay for an education, right? At a college, for instance, a university, we say that's good. It keeps professors accountable. It puts food on your professor's table. You certainly want that. But it has, to some extent, turned education into a commodity that I purchase. Robbie Dakel and some of the administration at Grace Christian School can tell you about this mentality. Students, as consumers, will then expect that things be tailored to them, right? Because if I'm the buyer, if I'm the consumer, everything else I spend money on in life caters to me, right? And so that's in part contribute. And so if you live in a therapeutic culture of the psychologized self, then college is not the place you go to be challenged, shaped, molded, developed. Now, please, let me be clear. Hear what I didn't say. I didn't say nobody goes to college today in order to be molded, shaped, educated, etc. I'm just saying that it's no longer a given that that's what the university exists for in our present cultural moment. This also brings us back to what C.S. Lewis called the historical point of view. He called it that through Screw Tape. So if we can go there next. I don't know if you could read that, but I've got it here for you. So this is Screw Tape talking. Please remember, this is meant to be like Lewis through Lewis's demon, the demonic voice. The historical point of view, put briefly, means that when a learned man is presented with any statement of an ancient author, the one question he never asks is whether it is true. He asks, who influenced the ancient writer? How far the statement is consistent with what he said in other books? What phase this is in the writer's development? The general history of thought it illustrates? How it affected later writers? How often it's been misunderstood, especially by the learned man's own colleagues? And what the general course of criticism on it has been for the last 10 years, and what is the present state of the question? Everything you could possibly ask about it except whether or not it's right. To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge, to anticipate that what he said could possibly modify your thoughts or your behavior, this would be rejected as unutterably simple-minded. And this is Screw Tape. Since we cannot deceive the whole human race all the time, it is most important to cut them off, to cut every generation off from all the others. For where learning makes a free commerce between the ages, there is always the danger that the characteristic errors of one may be corrected by the characteristic truths of another. But thanks be to our Father, that's Satan, and the historical point of view, great scholars are now as little nourished by the past as the most ignorant mechanic who holds that history is bunk. So history is garbage. So this is, that resonated so much with me. I mean, I read the Screw Tape letters for the first time when I was in Edinburgh in a PhD, master's in a PhD program, being told to examine something from every possible angle, particularly in this case Luther and then later the Puritans, except for whether or not they were right. But I mean, this idea that Screw Tape mentions that acknowledges free commerce between the ages, if you have that, if you have the present talking to the past a lot, then there's a danger that they're going to correct our errors. Now, we look back and we can see theirs super clearly because their errors are not ours. But our errors were not theirs. And so when we look back, there's this commerce that Lewis calls it between the ages that helps us a great deal. So it is that if you read early church fathers, you're going to read stuff. If you read ancient church fathers and their literature, your stuff's just going to be in there. You're going to be like, what? Why is that even important to you? Like, why does that even matter? What are you on about? And it's because they're trying to fix something that now we might maybe take for granted. And I think it was something Bob Vincent said that has always stuck with me. He said it in a sermon, and it just kind of found its way into my brain and has never left. He said, it is true enough that the Bible's full of things that are culturally different from us, right? So the Bible's full of stuff that is part of a culture that's different from ours. True enough. And what Bob at the time was addressing was those who would say, well, this is really just a cultural aspect in the Bible, that was then, this is now. And Bob just basically said, have you ever stopped to consider that if the Bible says something about culture that's different from yours, maybe the Bible means to correct your culture, right? Yeah, I mean, rather than just sort of reducing it to, oh, that's a nice little cultural artifact of yesteryear, whatever. So, any thoughts or questions on that? Yeah, Mr. Frank.
I think culture and language are the two differences that we haven't even ever about it. Otherwise, they react the same way, they think the same way.
Yes,
Those
that's
are the only two things that they're both man-made.
that's right. Yeah, I loved my one thing my Old Testament professor at Liberty said that stuck with me. He said, "How different is their culture from ours?" Old Testament antiquity. He said, and he just paused and he said, "They might as well have been on the moon." And that was how he started our Old Testament backgrounds class, where we started studying ancient culture. And he said, just start with that assumption. They might as well have been on the moon, and then you can start to maybe understand some things. All right, so this is the part I was most looking forward to in our last 15 minutes or so. Some advice I want to offer, some thoughts I want to offer. Still developing thoughts, by the way. These are things I've not had enough time to really think on and develop, but I want to offer them to you. So again, the perennial question that keeps coming up, usually from Daniel Moore, he's not in here right now, but Daniel's always pushing the questions of application, and so are so many of you. So I'm going to offer, and these are some things that reading Truman has helped me to conclude. So I'm just going to go ahead and put them up here. These are about 12 things for life in the therapeutic psychologized world. Number 1, do not apologize for living in the world that God made. And do not be embarrassed by what he has said. Here's my rationale. Those who would oppose all that God has said and all that God has made and refuse to call good what God has made, they confess it like it's true. Okay? So my neighbors, by which I don't mean I don't know if my literal neighbors believe this, but my United States of America neighbors who believe there are 57 genders live as though it's true, okay? And they don't apologize for it. And so my starting place is to say, neither do you, okay? And neither do we. Speak the language of Christianity. Speak the language of the Bible, gently but firmly. So don't be a snowflake, right? And by don't be a snowflake, I mean when the enemies of Christianity come in opposition against Christianity in your backyard, so to speak, don't throw a temper tantrum. Are you kidding me? That's just not our way. That's not who we are. Panic is not our way. And rage is certainly not our way. Like, imagine Jesus Christ going to the cross silent before his accusers, for heaven's sake. So don't be a snowflake, but confess your doctrine with the same convictions that your secular neighbors do. When mocked, just ask why. Why do you believe that? So don't be afraid of being seen as naive or outdated. Like, there have been a lot of Christians cowed into fear for fear that their neighbors will see them as like outdated or old-fashioned. Just confess your faith. Number 2, watch your mouth. That is, reflect on the way you use words. This goes back to my point about, like, if Marissa and I had a dog, we would not be a family. Words matter, right? So that's what I mean by watch your words, watch your mouth. Reflect on the way you use words, okay? The first step toward the destruction of a thing, in this anti-culture stuff we've been talking about, the first step toward destruction of a thing is diluting the definition, okay? Marriage is a good example here. So just care about the words that you use, okay?
The word gay was stolen.
The word gay, the rainbow, yeah. Number 3, know your history as best you can. This really does matter because right now the running belief is that history can be reduced to, please hear my verb here, reduced to the powerful oppressing those with less power. Has that happened in history? Of course it has. Is that the tale of history? No. No. Your historical eyes have to be a bit bigger than that. Which they can't be if you don't know history. Number 4, run the wisdom experiment. I borrowed this from Tim Keller, who basically talked about he said, let's just call it a wisdom experiment when he talked about gay marriage and stuff like that. He says, look, if you know history, you should be able to agree on a few things. And one of those things is that a lot of the stuff we're talking about with gay marriage, with, for instance, gay adoption, transgenderism, is untried. Okay? So we are launching ourselves into a great big social experiment. Right? So Keller is saying, I borrowed this from Keller. He just said, let's run the experiment. You go ahead and run the experiment, and we will keep our communities. Okay? And then in 50 years, let's see which one of us still exists. Let's just run the experiment and be okay with that. Right? And to some extent, I think that's helpful just as a mentality. To be like, well, we're going to keep on being Christians in a weird, messed up world. Let's go ahead and run the experiment and see what happens. And like Daniel, yeah. And so, and I got to confess to you guys, I've got some maybe ancient, weird-sounding beliefs on this. Like, I believe that the ground that I'm standing on and the building I'm standing in has a far better chance of outlasting Centenary College. Why? Because there's an abortion clinic down the street from Centenary College, and when there's innocent blood spilled on your ground, the land tends to vomit you out. Right? Yeah. And so I'm just, right, that's a really ancient way of thinking about this stuff, and I'm okay with it. So let's run the experiment. Let's just see what happens. Okay? Fight emotivism wherever you see it. Okay? So that is, don't allow yourself, insofar as you can, you're never going to do this perfectly, but insofar as you can, don't just make arguments based on just sheer how you feel. This is what I feel, so it must be good. Just kind of check yourself with that stuff and be honest about it. So like Marissa and I try to practice this, just, she and I both have said to each other, okay, well, this is what I feel, but that's all I got. So, maybe I'm way off here because it's just kind of an impulse feeling that's hit me, and maybe it's way off. Versus like, this is what I know, this is what I can show for, things like that. Number 6, support liberty. Okay, so we have to be more supportive of liberty and freedom, and I think particularly freedom of speech, than we thought we would have to be, while also being more precise in our politics than I think we have been. So when I say support free speech, I didn't say support the Republican Party. Right? So it's like, I think Christians are going to have to support liberty because freedom of speech is a Christian concept. They got it from us. Right? So we can keep on upholding it, but we're going to have to be a lot more precise than we have been, especially when it comes to like party fidelity and stuff like that. Number 7, fight utilitarianism wherever you see it. What is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is it works, so it must be good. Right? So it gets the numbers, it gets the people in the building, so it must be good. It gets the attention of our people around us, so it must be good, our methods or whatever. There was some debate a while back, and I don't know where the debate is today, to be honest. But when I was in seminary, about a particular method of evangelization of Muslims that made use of the Quran. It was kind of fascinating. Basically what it said is it was like, well, you're a good and faithful Muslim. I'm a Christian. Actually, this method started with I'm a Muslim too, because to be a Muslim means to be in submission to God, and I'm in submission to God, and already I'm like, okay, words matter, words have meanings, and they matter. And then the next step was to say, let's open up that Quran you've got and look at what it says about Jesus. Oh, interesting. It says that, it says he's a prophet, but then, and I'm sorry, now I'm blanking on it, but basically, even the version of Jesus in the Quran, he does some things that a prophet doesn't normally do. And so the sort of method is to say, isn't that interesting? We see Jesus in the Quran here doing stuff that prophets don't normally do. So maybe he's more than a prophet. Let's go look and see what the New Testament has to say then about this man who's more than a prophet. The result is that even if you get people who will say, wow, I guess he is more than a prophet, and maybe even is the Son of God, they hang on to their Qurans. And why wouldn't they? You've told them that that's just as trustworthy. Okay? But it gets results. Oh, it gets some numbers. Ooh, utilitarianism. That's utilitarianism, okay? So just, if it works, it must be good, right? Is basically the utility of it. If it gets results, it must be good, which is how we treat a lot of education, right? If it gets me a job, it must be worth learning. If it doesn't get me a job and money, it must not be worth learning. right? Why do we have to learn this stuff? When are we going to use it? Utilitarianism, right? And by the way, side note, heresy can produce some really nice people, right? So there may be, again, well, like, yeah, I mean, they believe in absolute heresy, and it's utterly, it's condemnable by Scripture, but like they're really nice. And terrible methods can produce false converts. So just, Number 8, make war on your anxiety and your fear and your fragility, because they pervade our culture. And if the church can be a place of a family of people who know how to stand with a certain degree of emotional stability, we are going to look really weird in this world, y'all. And there are some promises in the Bible about anxiety that we just don't believe anymore because our world is so pervasively anxious. So let me throw this at you. A very popular metaphor for church that's been used in the last few decades is hospital. Like the church is a hospital for like sick sinners, and they come in and they get the gospel, and then they're kind of given a sense of restored to spiritual health, and that's fair enough. I would also like us to incorporate another metaphor that Paul uses, which is that of a gymnasium. Okay? So yes, the church is a hospital, but it's also a place where training and strengthening and maturing happens, right? Yes, it's a hospital, but eventually you get out of the bed, you go to the gym, and you get strong, right? And so not only hospital, but gymnasium. This is especially for young men, which our culture is mostly left behind and stop caring for. And so the hospital metaphor, that'll be for when all this falls apart, wisdom experiment, okay? The hospital metaphor will kick into play in the next few decades when this experiment falls apart, and we're going to have to be EMTs on the scene, so to speak. John Piper is really good at this. He's already got like a whole biblically rooted I said that I was an atheist and a homosexual, and then I married this person, and now I'm a Christian, and I don't believe that I should be married to this person, so what should I do? And Piper's already got like this stuff ready to go. He's like, well, the Bible tells you that if you make a vow that's actually a sinful vow, you are released from it. So, and he walks them through those scriptures. And so like Piper's already a few years down the road here on this, and I think that's really, really good. Number 9. I'm moving through these quickly because I'm almost out of time, sorry. Set the free speech toleration example by way of stable, patient, long-suffering. This goes back to the don't be a snowflake stuff, right? So if somebody says something crazy, maybe don't blow up on them. And maybe trust that God might be working on them on a project that the Lord is working in them that could take up to 5 or 10 years, and you are patient enough to let that happen. Number 10, kick the dog, comfort the child. Okay, this is from Martin Luther, who said that false teachers are like dogs, and they consume those, they consume naive people and people who don't understand the truth. And then there are children who get misled or bit by the false teachers, right? And when you deal with those two groups, you deal with them differently. When a child gets bit by a dog, you don't punish the child, you punish the dog. So you're going to deal with a false teacher a lot more firmly than you're going to deal with somebody who's misled, all right? Or not taught or not instructed properly. Like one's going to take a lot more firmness, one's going to take a lot more compassion. And Luther referred to this as kicking the dog and comforting the child. I know we don't kick the dog, but yeah. Or one might say, fight the barbarians and comfort the children, but yeah, something to think about. Number 11, tell the truth about the moment. So that's just kind of own the moment that you're in. Don't be a martyr about it, but the stuff that we've learned from Truman about where we are, it's just a reality. Like, okay, so this is the world we live in, kind of therapeutic self, and this is what the roots of that. More on that perhaps later. I'm still working on that one, but I'm just saying that you can be honest with people about kind of why things are the way they are with the knowledge you now have from the stuff from Schumann. Number 12, be a happy Trinitarian. Now, what is going on there? Okay, that means, because I don't know if you know this, but there's not like one explicit proof text in the Bible for the Trinity that you just drop like a grenade and you're like, boom, Trinity, get out of here, right? The Trinity is a concept that fits together what the revelation that occurs between the testaments of God the Father sending His Son and filling his people with the Holy Spirit. Point being, if you confess the Trinity, you don't read the Bible like it's a printer manual. Okay? We have sometimes started to act that because the Bible, because the Bible doesn't, for instance, I'm being a little cheeky here, but so the Bible doesn't specifically designate who should take out the trash. That means men and women are basically the same because the Bible doesn't give us like a super explicit outline of who's in charge of which responsibilities. No, that's very silly. We are people of the book, yes, people of the Scriptures. We are also in the company of a cloud of witnesses, right? Those who have gone before us. And so not, as Jennifer and I have talked about, not tradition for tradition's sake. However, if you are going to overturn what 200 years of Christians before you thought, you'd better have a compelling argument. It had better be better than, well, I just kind of don't see it that way. You better be ready to do better than that. That's all kind of I'm insisting on. And Trinitarians can do that because we're informed by a lot of those who have gone before us. And I had 13 and 14 that aren't on there. 13 is love your roots and refuse to hate your fathers. And I don't mean your literal fathers, but your fathers that go back and back and back. And then number 14, hate your cynicism. Because that's just not wisdom. It looks like wisdom, but it's not. All right, so I'm over my time. I apologize. I apologize to people who can't hear me because they still have your kids. So happy to stick around and talk more. Sorry to race through that so quickly. But this is step one of some ideas I'm playing with. And happy to talk to you more about them. Father, thank you so much for this time you've given us. And I pray that amidst all my kind of ramblings in 1,000 different directions, that you've helped to equip your people and me and our families that are represented here by us in this room, that you would help us, Lord, to live humbly, and not in constant suspicion of our neighbors, rather in constant suspicion of ourselves, for the sake of Jesus, who has saved even us. And so, with that reality in view, we know you can do anything. And so in that very confidence, help us to live as contented people in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, and as ones who have seen you take out a heart of stone and put in a heart of flesh, with every confidence that is the power that you have. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.